So actually what you need depends a lot on what you've been used to. And the whole point of pensions, it's not just about keeping you out of poverty. It's about enabling your standard of living to keep going when you don't have a wage anymore. And in that case, the more you've been used to earning, the more you've got to provide for yourself to top up the basic state pension.
This episode is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Hello and welcome to the Investing Insiders podcast, where we help you achieve financial well-being by making smarter money decisions. I'm Brianne.
And I'm Antonia.
And in this episode, we'll be taking a look at your pensions and ways that you can grow your wealth to make sure you have enough for a comfortable retirement. Joining us today is Sir Steve Webb, a former pensions minister and partner at consulting firm Lane, Clark and Peacock. Steve, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Brianne. Hello, Antonia. Nice to be with you both.
We are over the moon to have you here today to pick your brain about the incredible world of pensions and all of the things that people need to look out for. You've been instrumental in some of the biggest changes to the pension system, particularly around the introduction of the triple lock, which we'll dig into a bit later. What would be great as a starting point is to have a look into your experience and how you think we are as a nation in terms of saving for pensions. Are we putting enough aside?
I think most of us aren't putting enough aside. That would be my starting point. And we're going through a sea change at the moment. If I think of my parents' generation, they had a lot of certainty. They had a state pension at, in my dad's case, 65, in my mom's case, 60. That hadn't changed for 100 years. I mean, that was been very static. My dad worked for businesses that had a company pension that paid actually when he was 65 as well. My mum worked in local government, so she had a local government pension, and they had to make virtually no decisions of their own. So they got a state pension when they reached pension age, they got their company, their workplace pensions. Those pensions lasted as long as they did, were protected against inflation. They didn't have to worry about the stock market, choose investments, none of that. If I think about my children's generation, so I'm 60 now, so if I kind of roll forward to the next generation down, they'll have none of that. If they work in the private sector, they will have a state pension, which will probably be paid at 68, 69, maybe 70. Come back to that. And then they'll have a pot of money, or lots of pots. We come back to that. But, and they'll have to decide how that grows. And obviously a lot of that's done for you, but you have to think about that, when to take it, how to take it. So we really have shifted a huge amount of onus onto individuals. Many of us, ordinary people with lives to lead, haven't necessarily got the skills to deal with all of this. So it's a big shift.
Do you feel that that shift has been a necessary part of us adjusting to, our economic climate and it's a natural progression? Or is it the case that actually things used to just work a lot better and we've kind of gone backwards a bit?
We have gone backwards a bit in the sense that, if you go back to the 60s, the 70s and so on, a company might look after its best paid employees pretty well. We're mostly talking men. Often women couldn't even join the scheme in some cases, or part-timers couldn't. So there's a lot of gender inequality in all of this. But, if you were in a good job with a good company and they set up one of these pension schemes for you, that was great. That was to die for. And what's gradually happened over time is the cost of providing those pensions has got more and more expensive. Although there are interruptions to this, we're living longer, compared with when these schemes are set up, living far longer. Governments have laid rules and regulations on top and said, well, if you provide a pension, you've got to protect against inflation. And that's very expensive. So companies who freely, voluntarily offered these pensions to some of their workers suddenly said, well, hang on a minute, this is expensive, it's volatile, I don't know from one year to the next what it's going to cost, people are living longer, it's unpredictable, I'm not having this. So they pulled the plug. And then what they've replaced it with is broader. So, things like automatic enrolment, which now means essentially you earn $10,000 a year, your employer has to put you in a pension. That's broadened coverage massively, but the average amount people have got has dropped calamitously. So far, far more people have got pensions full stop. But for most people, they're just at the start, the foothills, really.
It's really interesting, the sort of shift in, I suppose, responsibility and taking care of your retirement package when you decide to stop working. One of the things you touched on was the element of the state pension. And it would be great to hear your thoughts on what proportion of somebody's pension makeup should the state pension be?
I mean, in many ways, the new state pension, I should declare an interest because I kind of designed it, was intended to be simpler than what went before. So we used to have a really complicated state pension system. You had a basic pension and an earnings-related bit on top, and you could opt out of that. Nobody knew what they were going to get. The new system is designed to be broadly flat rates. So from April, it will be about £12,500 a year. And most people retiring from now on will get that figure. They won't get less, they won't get more. That's what they will get. Now, if you come into the UK halfway through your working life, it's different. There are gaps, but most people, and a nice feature of the new system is for men and for women, the number is essentially identical. And you might think, well, of course it should be, and of course it should be, but historically it hasn't been. Historically, married women in particular had much worse state pensions, and part of the point of the new reform was to treat men and women essentially the same. So give or take 1% or 2%, the average man, the average woman is going to get that figure. So that's kind of the good news. We have certainty that that's the sort of figure to expect, 12,500 in today's money. Now, question, Brian, you asked is, well, how much of your retirement income should that make up? And a lot depends on what you've been used to before you were retired. So if you've been earning 15,000 a year steadily, perhaps that's a low pay job or a part-time job or whatever, 12,500 is pretty good. Because once you're retired, you're not paying national insurance, maybe you haven't got a mortgage, you haven't got childcare, travel to 12,500 quid is what you've been living on. So if that's all you've got, the pension gets you all the way. If you've been on 50,000 a year, you don't want to go down to 12.5. So actually what you need depends a lot on what you've been used to. And the whole point of pensions, it's not just about keeping you out of poverty. It's about enabling your standard of living to keep going when you don't have a wage anymore. In that case, the more you've been used to earning, the more you've got to provide for yourself to top up the basic state pension.
Can I just sort of circle back to the gender issue that you just brought up? So, and I genuinely don't know the answer to this. I'm just interested. You just mentioned that men and women will largely get the same amount, but the amount that you get from the state pension is dependent on your contributions. Is that right? So are women less likely to have full contributions because they're taking those breaks in terms of doing childcare and maternity leave and all of those sort of things? Should they still be getting contributions when they take maternity leave?
And the answer is they do, essentially. So there is a system of what are called national insurance credits. So if you're at home with a child, man or woman, doesn't matter, whoever's getting the child benefit, if you're at home with a child for a year, you get a full year's contributions, the same as if you were a millionaire running a company. 1 year. A year is a year is a year. So the whole system has lots and lots of these credits for raising children, credits for being a carer, credits if you're unemployed and looking for a job, credits if you're sick and looking for, so for that reason, men and women are now reaching pension age with very similar contribution records.
So that's if you're claiming child benefit. If you're taking time out of work to raise a child and you're not claiming child benefit because maybe your husband earns more than 60K, then you will have that gap, won't you?
They're going to fix that. So this was an anomaly. So when they brought in what's called the high income child benefit charge that you mentioned, where the higher earner incurs a charge which can wipe out the child benefit, a group of people, mostly mothers, stopped claiming or didn't claim in the first place. And that's left them with the gap that you just quite rightly described. So the government recognises that was never meant to happen. So it has committed to creating another batch of credits that people will be able to patch. And it's horrible, complicated, but that will be patched up. That's the promise.
This is the issue, is that every time they identify a gap or anything like that, then they have to bring in a new rule. And we end up with, as someone has said to me, that the rule book is so thick now that you wouldn't even be able to pick it up. It just becomes more and more complex. But I imagine in the system that we have now, that the women who are retiring in the next, say, 20 years are going to fall shorter than men.
No, not at all. No. Partly because you only, slight simplification here, but you, quote, only need 35 years in the system to get a full pension. So even if you go to university and start work at 21, your state pension age is 66, 67, that's 45 years or something. So you can have plenty of missing years anyway and still get a full pension.
All right, that's good to know.
And I think that raises quite an interesting point about the state pension and what it potentially could evolve into. We obviously had a shift between the sort of old version of the state pension into the new state pension. Do you see any more changes coming into how it's provided, what it might look like, and when those shifts might kick in?
I think the biggest obvious change will be the age at which you can get it. So we know starting this April 2026, that the pension age will rise gradually from 66 to reach 67 by April 2028. So it doesn't go by a year overnight, it goes by a month and a month and a month. So there'll be some people whose pension age is 66 years and 2 months or something like that. So it goes up gradually. So by April 2028, it'll be 67. The government is doing a state pension age review as we speak. We already know there is a date for going to 68, which is in the mid-2040s. That will almost certainly be brought forward. And it would be surprising if people in their 20s and 30s weren't expected to work till 69 or 70 or something of that sort. So I think ages, as around the world, in fact, will continue to go up. The other big change, I think, will be, we mentioned the triple lock. So this is a very generous rule which says every year, how much rise do pensioners get? Well, they could get inflation, so they can always buy the same basket of goods in the shops. They could get the average wage rise that a worker's had. So if pensions are meant to keep track of what you used to earn, then if people in work get 5%, pensioners get 5%. So it's always the same proportion. And then sometimes both of those numbers are very, very low. So I remember back in the day, prices went up by 1% or something, wages less than that. And that gave pensioners a 75p increase. And there was, not quite rioting in the streets, but there was a lot of fuss. And so that's where this idea of a 2.5% minimum increase comes from, that you'll never get pennies. You will always get something. And those are the three elements of the triple lock. Now, I put the triple lock in place in about 2011. It's been going for 15 years, partly to undo the damage of the previous 30 years when the pension only went up by prices. And the point about that is for those 30 years, if wages were rising faster than prices, which they usually did, the pension was falling further and further behind what people have been used to earning. And as we said earlier, what you want is a pension that keeps tabs with what you used to earn, not falls behind. So the triple lock was trying to mend something. So I make no apology for it or for 15 years of it, but there will come a point when it stops. There has to be a point where it stops, at which point it'll probably be linked to the average wage or something like that.
Are we at that point?
More or less, I suspect. I mean, people say, oh, it's ruinously expensive, we can't possibly afford it. But it depends compared with what? Because yes, we could have a really cheap state pension. We could link back to inflation. And then we've just started to talk about how the fact that most people haven't got decent private pensions. So if we take our foot off the gas on the state pension and drastically reduce the increase on the state pension, and people haven't got decent private pensions, there's only one thing that will happen is people end up poor in retirement. And that's not a great outcome either.
So how do we compare when you look at us against Europe and places like that?
Well, our state pension tends to be less generous, and there's two reasons for that. One is we tax less. Although taxes have gone up a lot in the UK, traditionally Scandinavia, Germany and so on, France, just tax people more. And if you tax people more, you can spend more on state pensions. So there's a bit of you pay your money and take your choice on that. Voters in the UK have not tended to vote for people who will admit to, at least, taxing them a lot more than paying higher pensions.
Yes, everyone says that they're not going to do it, and then they do it.
Absolutely. But we do have a comprehensive private pension system, which not all other countries do. So in France, for example, your state pension is the lion's share, whereas in the UK, it's more 50-50. So, there are, I did the figure only earlier today, over £2 trillion sitting in private pensions. And that's going to turn into pensions. So if you've got one, if you've got your own pension pot on top, then actually state plus private puts you in the middle internationally.
So what do you think is the solution? If the triple lock is getting too expensive and we can't afford to carry on doing it, but we don't want people to be in pension poverty, what's the ideology there? What's the solution?
Yeah, I think there's two strands. So one is, yes, you might ease off on the triple lock a bit, but not go back to the bad old days of price link. So there is if you link to the average wage. So you might say the state pension should be a third of the national average wage, something like that. So say, I'm going to make the numbers really round, say 35,000 is an average full-time wage or something like that. And the state pension's about 12. So nearly a third, just more than a third, something like that. And then you say, but most people don't want to go down from 30 odd thousand to 12. So you then need your private pension. And that's where we need to bump up the amount going in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do quite a lot of videos on social and on pensions as well. And I do see a lot of people sort of going, oh, it's already quite stingy and, it's not a lot to live off and all of this sort of thing. And I'm like, well, yeah, you need to deal with that situation yourself, by saving into private pensions. But I think it's not actually an option for everybody. And there's this knowledge gap. So a lot of people actually leave it too late and they get to sort of their 40s and go, oh my God, I haven't got any time left now to save it all up. So it feels like there's an education gap there when it comes to pensions, because if someone was in their 20s, they could literally put some peanuts aside every month and it would help.
Yeah, I would see it very differently. So, first of all, your 40s is not remotely too late. If we're going to be working to our late 60s, that's a quarter of a century or something. So I say to someone who's 60, who's just been auto-enrolled, well, stay in, you get some free money from your employer, get a little lump sum, what's not to like? So if you only think about it in your 40s, and frankly, most people do, that's okay. So that's the sort of thing.
It's because retirement's so far away from
well, exactly.
Like there, immediate gratification. Thank you.
Yeah. I think for people in their 20s, I'm a big fan of not opting out. So if your employer puts you in a pension, they choose it for you, they set it up, they're putting some money in, stay in, fine. But then if perhaps you get a pay rise, career progression or whatever, making sure you don't have to pay a rent when you retire is vital financial planning. So for me, if I've got £30, £50, £100 a month to spare as my career progresses, I might well save for a deposit on a house as a retirement strategy, not to sell the house and live, to live in the house, because we know growing numbers of people are going to be paying a private rent in retirement, and that blows the numbers out of the water in terms of what you need. So for me, young people, don't opt out your workplace pension, but beyond that, prioritizing, trying to make sure you're not renting in retirement is a right answer for many people.
I think that's a really interesting point to pick up on, because a lot of people do grapple with priorities, particularly in their 20s and 30s. What do you prioritize? Putting money aside for retirement or trying to, get onto the property ladder and have an asset that you say can stop you from private renting later on? So it's quite interesting to kind of hear that as a potential strategy. I suppose when thinking about making sure that you have enough for retirement, I suppose the plan might change depending on how old you are. But as a general set of tips, what would you suggest people do when trying to make sure that they have enough in their pot so they have a comfortable time when they decide to stop working?
I think this is going to get a bit easier in the coming years to at least think about, because we probably next year we will have something called, that you're familiar with, a pensions dashboard. If you lived in the Netherlands or Sweden or Australia, you have that now. And the idea is you can go on a website, probably an app, and see all of your pensions, your state pensions, your pensions from different jobs in one place. And that will give you a forecast, a projection of what you've got and what that will turn into at retirement. And that will start that process of thinking, well, I've only got this much. I think I probably need twice that or whatever. And then you can start to put in place a plan. And that plan's different for everyone, single, part of a couple, a homeowner, renter, the industry, the pensions industry says people should save about 12% of their pay a year, of which a good chunk could come from the employer. So it's not you have to save 12%, it's 12% needs to go in. That's a rule of thumb. But to be honest, the best thing to do is look at yourself, what you've got, what jobs you've had, what your expectations are. And I always say, when you go on a journey, the first thing is to know where you're starting from. And too many people just don't even know where they're starting from. So I think the dashboard and, people such as yourselves, dare I mention Martin Lewis and others, will promote the dashboard. Millions of people will go to it, partly because people will find pensions they never knew they had. It'd be like a treasure trove. I constantly hear from members of the public who tell me about jobs they had 20, 30 years ago, and they just don't know where the pension went. And there'll be so many good news stories. And I think that will be a real trigger for engagement.
So how far off is this dashboard?
Well, people get very weary because they've been hearing about it approximately forever. But in fact, if you think about, I don't know if you can remember old style tellies that had real spaghetti at the back and all the different cables and all the rest of it. And the dashboard is like that telly with all the cables going into the back, but nobody's switched it on yet. So the cables are the information. And most information about most pensions is now plugged into the back of the telly. That's been done. What they're doing now is testing it. So people have literally switched it on in a quiet room, had a look, tested it, see how people reacted. Then they're going to give it to more people to test. So all of this takes time and you want to do it right. But I would be surprised if by the end of next year, probably, they haven't switched it on or thereabouts. And given how long we've been waiting, we're nearly there, I think.
I think that could be a game changer to finally have it go live. I think one of the things that can be a barrier is there's so many different bits of admin that people try to come to terms with. So having that all in one place, fingers crossed, should help smooth out the journey. I suppose what some people might be wondering is to what extent and to what role does financial advice, professional financial advice, play in the meantime? So before the dashboard comes out and whilst people try to grapple with working out these sums and what they might need, at what point do you think it might be wise to consider professional financial advice, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people for whom financial advice is excellent and good value for money, but there's an awful lot of people for whom what they need to do is pretty obvious. You know, if you are, I don't know, if you're in your 30s or 40s or whatever, you've got a job, you're in a workplace pension, not opting out. Perhaps if your employer will pay more in, if you pay more in, looking at that, because that's a phenomenal return if you can double your money overnight because the employer's matching, looking at things like that. As I say, trying to make sure you're not a renter in retirement. It's some pretty obvious things. Financial advice often helps with tax planning. So for people who have issues about, inheritance tax or higher rate income tax or, particular things they need to think about. So, I have paid for a couple of times one-off sessions with an advisor. So I don't have a financial advisor, but at a couple of points in my life, I thought, you know what, I just need to work this through with someone who ran some numbers, gave me some options. We agreed a fee. It was in the hundreds rather than the thousands in my case. And that just kind of gave me a bit of reassurance that I was on the right track. So, we're all different, but I think I want a system where most people, without having to be experts, without having to pay for advice, can get a pretty decent outcome. And fine, if you want to pay for advice, great, that. But it shouldn't be an essential. It should be a nice to have, in my view.
This episode of the Investing Insiders podcast is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Saxo provides access to a broad range of global assets through a sophisticated trading platform. You can trade US stocks from as little as $1 per trade and UK stocks from $3 per trade. Please remember that all investing involves risk. The value of your investments can go down as well as up, and you could get back less than you invest. Terms and conditions apply. Visit Saxo Markets to learn more.
One of the issues that we've found is that I don't know if you've seen it. We did all this analysis on pension fund performance, and it did vary wildly. So basically, some people are getting great outcomes, and some people, through no fault of their own, are getting awful outcomes. And if you don't have any financial knowledge, I mean, in our experience, a lot of people don't actually know that their pension's invested.
Yeah.
So they won't know that their outcome is differing from other people's. So that becomes an issue then. And I know that you have this sort of system set up where you can take money out of your pension, £500 up to 3 times after the age of 50, to pay directly for financial advice. And that's in place, I think, so that people can make the right decisions when it comes to drawdown, because the way that you draw down can really affect your outcomes in retirement. But so when I pointed this out on social, a lot of people said, well, why can't we do the same thing earlier on when actually that might have an even bigger effect on our outcome at the end? And I was sort of thinking, well, yeah, actually, it's a fair question.
Yeah. No, and unfortunately, it's not mandatory. So not all pension providers actually facilitate
exactly.
it. So you might be in a pension, So I think if we just take a step back, so what is the pension that most people have? It's one chosen for them by their employer. So automatic enrolment comes in, your employer chooses a pension for you. You do not choose it. So you might be with a big household name insurance company, Aviva, Standard Life, Scottish Widows, whoever. You might be with Nest, the government scheme. You might be with the People's Pension. There's 20 or 30 big schemes like this you might be in. And as your research shows, inevitably those schemes invest differently and have achieved different returns. Some of that is deliberate. So some of them have sat down and said, you know what, our membership actually wants something pretty predictable, pretty vanilla, pretty boring, which may not shoot the lights out, but won't crash either. So they've picked a risk-return mix that's at the lower end of the scale by design. And there are some which cater mainly for higher earners who know that higher earners can cope a bit better if the numbers go up and down and probably do better as a result. So some of your numbers at the top of your league table will be people who are willing to take a bit of investment risk, take a punt, knowing that their members are comfortable with it. Some at the lower end will be deliberately targeting a lower return but lower risk mix. And that's kind of okay if that fits you. Where I have a problem is where people have targeted a high return and not got it, or targeted boring and got, So there is variation. Question, what can the member do about that though? And the answer is not much, because what are they going to do? They could move the money out of the default fund, which is the fund that most people's money just gets shoved into. Other funds are available within the same pension provider, but frankly, nobody would have a clue where to put it instead. I mean, and there is some evidence that on the whole, people who opt out of the default fund on average do worse than people who stay put. You imagine, there's this kind of sunlit uplands and you go off over here and it'll all be fine. But actually, mostly the default fund is managed by people who know what they're doing, who are professionals. And if you take a punt, you might do well, but on average, you probably pay more because there's a charge cap on the default fund and there isn't a charge cap on the other fund. So it's not clear what people can do if their own workplace pension isn't doing fantastically well, other than say to the employer, look, have you chosen a good workplace pension for me? So they can do that. They can contact the trustees and say, well, hang on a minute, why are we doing so badly relative to someone else, and challenge them and hold them to account. But if they had a financial advisor, what will they do? Because if they give up on the workplace pension, they throw away the employer money, and that's almost certainly a bad thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different nuances here, but in my experience, I think employers are ticking a compliance box, and they're not necessarily putting in a whole bunch of research and going, what's the best possible pension that I can put down for my staff? And a lot of them, I mean, like, even when you look at things like Nest, which is, I think, one of the biggest providers now.
Yes, biggest scheme.
It's the biggest scheme. So they charge 1.8% on contributions before you've even invested the money. So everything that you put into your pension, 1.8% straight into the scheme.
But they then have a very low ongoing charge, one of the lowest in the industry.
They're a very cost-effective solution for employers, but I can put pension...
Well, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't cost the employer anything. I mean, the employer just picks a provider. So.
Yeah, so I could put money into a pension for a lot less money than 1.8.
Well, you've got to look at both bits, because your money... Yes, you're right. There is this upfront contribution charge, which will eventually be abolished once they've paid back the money they borrowed from the government. But at the moment, there is that. But then every year, that 0.3% is below the average. So if you're in Nest as against most of the schemes, the amount going out each year for running it is smaller. So you take the two together, it averages about 0.5. When you take the two together, it comes about 0.5. So Nest isn't the cheapest, but nor is it the most expensive.
Okay. And the other question I had to ask you on that was, there's a lot of sentiment from the general public around, don't worry about all of these pension funds. Stick your pension into an all-world tracker fund or an index fund and leave it there. What would you say about that?
I guess first question is, are you talking about additional money or instead of your workplace pension? So I wouldn't opt out of a workplace pension because you're throwing away
private pension,
the employer contribution.
This is private pension.
So if you have got extra money, you could take a punt on global shares. And if you've done that for the last 10 years, you'd have done very well. You wouldn't have done very well in the last month.
No.
Thanks
again.
Yes. So the question, at time of recording. So the question is, are you okay about that? If you're okay about that, if you're in for the long haul and you don't sweat and worry and get upset when things like that happen, well, that's fair enough. But actually, a lot of people don't want 100% equities because higher returns come with higher risk often. So, it's horses for courses on this, and that is where advice could come more in place,
Yeah, I mean, we are sort of, what we're trying to do is encourage people to take more of an active role in their pension and have a look at it and engage with it and check on it, because, some people, like the lifestyling can be a little bit off these days. I think it was more appropriate when people were buying a final amount at the end, but it's kind of holding people back a little bit now, and people have been dumped into default funds that aren't doing very well and things like that. So we are trying to encourage people to take more of an active role in that. Have you spoken to anyone about this sort of thing, like how you get people engaged?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in nudges and defaults rather than, so I always said as the minister, I wanted a system where people who didn't really know very much, who didn't really care very much, who didn't really engage very much, got a pretty decent outcome. I don't believe in a system that depends upon people being engaged, because most people are too busy or haven't got the ability to do it. So we shouldn't require it. Fine if people want to. I have no problem with that at all. And so, interesting question. So I've got my basic mandatory level of saving. I can opt out, but I haven't. And you're saying I've got some extra cash. And one option is I go off to private pension, I stick in global trackers and pay 0. Diddly squat and hope it goes up. But I could put extra money into my workplace pension. And that is then managed professionally. It's diversified, so it's not just in global shares, it's in domestic shares, it's in bonds, increasingly it's in infrastructure and private markets. And, that's very professionally managed. Now, you would say some of your research has shown that some of these schemes haven't done very well over the period you've looked at.
20 years.
Yeah, but some of these weren't in existence 20 years ago.
No. So if we had 20 years worth of data, we used that, but everything had to have at least 5.
Yeah. And, the last 5 years have been staggeringly untypical. Just if you think about it, what have we had? We've had as many black swan events as you normally get in a century. We've had a global pandemic. We've had war in Europe. We've had more chancellors than you can shake a stick at. Is that 5 years? Does that 5 years tell you that you're in a lousy pension scheme? Or you're just in a pension scheme that chose to invest in a particular way 5 years ago for the long haul, for you as a 30-year-old, for when you're 70, and the first 5 years didn't look particularly exciting. I would argue with you a bit about describing these as kind of rubbishy old. You just use the word dumped in a different, these are not sloppy, poorly managed things that are doing shoddy things with people's money. Even the worst ones in your research have beaten inflation, for example, which you wouldn't have done if you stuck it in an ISA. So, I think you got to keep this in perspective.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. That it is beating inflation. But I mean, I suppose what people are looking for is strong growth for their retirements, and and that's what we're sort of just trying to help. And and it's sort of, it gives you confidence if you can see your pension growing nicely, and people get a lot of so and so down the road is doing better than me.
Well, and it's worth saying that there is going to be a set of red, amber and green ratings for pension schemes.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say the name of the Consumers Association of which, but, they'll do a best buy on a vacuum cleaner or something like that. Well, you're going to get government rules that require every pension scheme, including the ones that were in your research, to look at their rate of return on investments in the last 1, 3, 5 years and longer if data's available, look at the quality of service, look at their forecast returns in the future, and come up with a red, amber, light green, dark green rating. And that will all be public and published. And that's the world we're moving into. It doesn't happen yet, but it's coming. So there's legislation going through now to do that. And part of the idea, come back to your point about employers, is employers who may not have a clue will be able to look and say, well, actually, I don't just need to go for the cheapest one, the lowest charge one. Actually, that one over there is dark green. That's the best. They've knocked the lights out. They're really good. I'm going to choose that for my workers. So that's coming. So it isn't quite as placid and status quo as it perhaps has been. There's going to be a lot more information and competition and comparison going on.
It does sound like there's a lot of moving parts, I think, that hopefully will be coming together to create a more digestible picture of what pensions look like and what they mean to individual people. I think one of the things Antonia and you, Steve, have both touched on is the idea of trying to get value and whether that value comes from being completely engaged and immersed in the numbers that you're seeing on your, pension provider's dashboard, or taking active steps for yourself. So looking at, say, the past 5 years, which have been very tumultuous, we've had a lot of unprecedented events which have affected pension investment performance. What would you say to people that might be looking at their, pension performance at the moment and thinking, do I need to make a move? Do I need to take action? What's the difference between, say, contextualizing the last 5 years and also, trying to prepare yourself to make sure you get value by the time that you retire?
I think I'd probably charge to answer that question. I should say none of this is authorised financial advice, just for the avoidance of doubt. I'm sure you say that at some point, but no. I mean, there's one thing that investment professionals will tell you, which is that diversification, spreading, is almost a free lunch. In the sense that you can invest across a range of different things, and again, you won't shoot the lights out, but you're probably protecting your downside as well. So I used to work for a firm called Royal London. They had this kind of map showing how 1 year commodities did well, the next year corporate property did well, the next year it's global equities, the next year, and you can hope to pick the best one of those, but good luck to you. And what they did was they had what were called, and other people provide these as well, multi-asset funds. So they would be investing in lots of these different things, and they'd change the weights sometimes, but you were invested across a range of things which didn't all tend to go up or down together. So if one thing was, so give you an example, sometimes you have what they call a kind of rush to safe harbor, like gold, for example. I'm not recommending that particularly, but people sometimes, when things are insecure and things are not doing very well in one part of the system, people buy gold or commodities or whatever. So that bit of the package is going up when another bit's going down. So it's dampening down. So particularly for people who are anxious about big losses, who want to do well, but, actually just find it. And there are obviously people who do this for you. You don't have to kind of sit down with a wet towel and think, well, shall I have 15% in real estate or something? There are multi-asset funds that do this kind of thing for you. And that's worth having a look at, I think, rather than thinking, I'll invest in the Colombian stock market or something,
Yeah, I think that does kind of take a lot of pressure off of trying to have everything figured out for yourself. And a great reminder of the fact that pensions, like with finance generally, it's not fixed. There are, micro actions that you can take to hopefully get to where you want to be at that point. So all very valuable.
Steve, I've got a question. You sound like you've really got your finger on the pulse in terms of policies that are happening now. How do you think that they're doing? Let's have it. Give us all the bells and whistles and the dirt and everything.
Yeah. I mean, it's tempting to think that when you get a change of government, as we had in 2024, that everything gets thrown up in the air. It's all completely different. And what's striking is how much continuity there has been. A lot of what the new government did on pensions was stuff the previous lot had thought about and started and now developed. So the dashboard started years ago. The idea of value for money scores started years ago. The idea of getting fewer, bigger funds who might then invest more to grow the economy started years ago. So actually, although we get very excited about a budget and some dramatic change, a lot of this is kind of gradual and progressive and so on. And where we're moving to is a world where in the private sector, most people will have these pot of money, what they call in the industry defined contribution, pot of money type pensions. They'll have several from several jobs, and there are mechanisms coming to try and get them in one place, although that's very slow. And for most people, being part of a big, well-run, professionally managed scheme is going to be pretty good. We need contribution rates to go up, and there is a pensions commission the government set up last year that will report next year. And that's like to lay the groundwork in the 2030s, I think, for these 8% that we have to pay to go up to 10 to 12, that kind of thing. And that's essential, in my view. So I think a lot of that kind of stuff is going in the right direction. I suppose there's two criticisms I would have. One is the whole sort of the tax and the budgets and will tax-free cash be abolished and all that stuff. And if they would just say, look, for this parliament, we're not going to muck about with the taxation of pensions, that would be such a win. If they just say that, that would be great.
Because it caused a lot of damage.
Yeah, I mean, some of it's not the government. Some of it is, dare I say it, the press. If you are a newspaper that's not a fan of the government, you can get lots of clicks on your website by saying, rumours the government's going to abolish tax-free cash. And there may be no rumours, but there are once you phone somebody up and ask them, and they say, well, they might. That's a rumour. So actually, the government on the whole does not leak on this. They don't put something out saying, do you know what, in the budget, we might get rid of tax-free cash. They just don't. They can see the damage that does. And so they could stop it. That's my point. They could stop it. So that's the first thing, is just have some stability, stop the rumours, stop the speculation, just deal with that. The other thing is quite specific, is the government is currently threatening to force workplace pensions to invest in the things the government thinks they should invest in. Now,
this was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Go.
So they keep telling us they don't plan to do it. It's just being kept in reserve. And their argument is the industry keeps saying they're going to invest more in infrastructure and growth and startups and all that stuff, but never quite does it on the scale. So they've just got this stick in their back pocket, if you can do that, to say, if you don't do these promises you've made, we'll make you. And when you say to them, but you shouldn't, they say, oh, no, we don't plan to. Well, don't threaten it then. So that I don't think they will actually do that. But the fact they're taking the power to threaten to do it is just a mistake, in my view.
I thought I saw it being argued in Commons, this point between the two governments. And it feels like it's a bit of a boiling point at the moment.
Yes, so the way legislation works is it gets considered by the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and sometimes it does one first and sometimes the other first. So this legislation's completed the House of Commons, so all the MPs have voted on it, it's gone through unchanged. It's now in the House of Lords, and in the House of Lords, there's a lot more fuss, there's a lot more focus, a lot more expertise, frankly. So you've got former pensions ministers and people who've been in the industry in the House of Lords. There's not many MPs, to be honest, know or care much about pensions. So I just life, you know. I was the pensions minister.
I've seen this firsthand, actually. You mentioned something and they go, oh, yes.
Yeah, so it's just not, you know. The NHS, fine, you know, they kind of get hospitals. As soon as you say pensions, it's like, oh my goodness, you know. Whereas the House of Lords has some real expertise. So it is expected the government will be challenged and possibly even defeated on some of this. Now, then it goes back to the Commons and the MPs will just vote it through again and then go back to the Lords. And I don't know where it will end up. But there is at least some pushback going on.
Okay. It does tend to go backwards and forwards like this for a while. And everyone goes, are we not? You know, so that in itself can create a little bit of instability. But the idea is that it would give them the power, that mandate would give them the power to invest workplace pensions, default pension funds. We're not talking about all pensions. So if you have a private pension, that's still in your control.
With how, I guess, fundamental pensions are, and the idea that we need some kind of stability, some kind of continuity to measure how well we're going to be set up in later life, is there an argument to have pensions managed by something independent of, you know, different political mandates?
I mean, there have been attempts to do that. So about 20 years ago, there was something called the Turner Commission. So Adair Turner, who was a business leader, Baroness Drake, as she now is, a trade unionist, and an academic, Professor John Hill, sadly no longer with us. The three of them were what's called the Pensions Commission. And they spent a couple of years gathering data, gathering evidence, producing reports, and trying to build what they called a consensus. They call it the Turner consensus, this sense of we all broadly know what we need to do. And that paved the way for automatic enrolment. It paved the way for increased state pension ages and a few other things. And for a while, there was that cross-party consensus. So the automatic enrolment legislation started under a Labour government, was implemented by me as a Lib Dem minister in partnership with the Conservatives, was carried on after I wasn't minister by the Conservatives. So there have been bits that have survived. The bit that tends to be more political is tax and the whole sort of intergenerational fairness. And I think part of politics is, well, you know, my party thinks we don't do enough, say, for young people. Oh, well, my party thinks we need to do more for pensioners. My party thinks we should tax more and spend more. My party thinks we should tax less and spend less. And I don't think you can take those things out of politics because they are fundamental political questions. So I'm a big fan of stability as far as we can manage it. A big fan of not kind of mucking about the system and constantly changing it. But I just, even if we sat down today and said, right, we agree, we commit, there won't be all this political change in the future. There'll be a new government in 5 years' time and they do what they like. We can't stop them. So, you know, we should work for consensus and stability if we can, whilst recognising in the real world there are some very political issues in the middle of all of this.
Okay, that's fair enough. So, Steve, I've got another question. I don't know how old your children are, but if, let's say you had a 25-year-old who is paying off a student loan, is trying to save for a house, and has pensions hovering over them as well. With the cost of living crisis and how difficult everything is financially for that age group, What would your advice be?
I mean, my starting point is always that having been enrolled into a workplace pension, I take a lot of convincing you should opt out because you're throwing away the money your employer is putting in. That's just lost. So that basic level of pension saving, I think, is a good thing. As I've indicated, because you don't want to be a renter in retirement, to the extent you can prioritise the deposit, that feels to me like the next thing. And of course, the sooner that you are not paying a rent, so you might be living with mum and dad, well, that's fine, that's free or free-ish. But particularly if you've moved out and are renting privately already, you can see that money feels like it's going down the drain. So the sooner that you can start at least, say, paying a mortgage rather than a rent, that feels like a good place to be. And then over time, I remember the first few years of having a mortgage were the hardest financial years I can ever remember, because the mortgage, is at its hardest. It hasn't been eroded by inflation. Your pay hasn't gone up much. Really, really tight. But 5, 10, 15 years down to having a mortgage, the mortgage is still the mortgage. Maybe you've added a bit to it, but hopefully your pay's gone up, prices have gone up and so on. And just that pressure eases off. And then perhaps you can think a bit more about putting a bit more into pensions, recognising you've potentially got other costs. You might have childcare costs, you might have other things. So, there's never an easy time to do any of these things. But I think one example I would say is the easiest time to put money in a pension is it's money you've never had. And what I mean by that is when you get a pay rise. So you've been used to the pay at such and such a level. You get a pay rise before you adjust to life at that higher level. Allocate some of the pay rise to yourself when you're older. All this is tough, but it's less tough if you do it when you haven't got used to spending it.
Yeah. So don't let the lifestyle creep come in. Yeah. Pay yourself first. Okay. That's very sound advice. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve. This has been invaluable. And we've got so many different tips for people. So yeah, thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure, and nice to speak to you both.
Thank you so much for joining our Investing Insiders podcast. If you like the episode, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on your platform of choice. For the latest money news and deals, you can sign up to our weekly newsletter at investinginsiders.co.uk/newsletter-page. We've also got a suite of guides, tools, and calculators on our website at investinginsiders.co.uk. You can also keep up to date with us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you in the next episode.